Well, good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Great. So, what we are doing today is a continuation from what we discussed last time. What did we talk about last time? The Great Depression. What do you know about the Great Depression? What? It was great. It wasn't great. It was big. It was very bad. And what was the main cause of the Great Depression? Other way. Decline in the money supply. Remember, there was massive deflation, right? All right. Now, all that deflation resulted in what? Bank runs and subsequent failures. So I organized this as 80 ships left, and that was the money supply falling. But if you have 80 shifting left, and then you have a money supply falls, and then what happens to the bank fail? How do you capture this idea of banks failing? I think I mentioned this at the end. I don't quite remember. Yeah, go ahead, John.
LRAS.
Yeah, exactly. Why does LRAS shift left? Just because we had some bank failures. What's the big deal about that? Richard, what function do banks serve in the economy?
Like lending money.
Lending money, right? Yeah. Yeah. They do when they make new loans, right? But the logistical value that they provide is that they are. We had a term. The lenders because they're connecting someone. Savers to borrowers, the financial intermediaries, right? Exactly. And so when you have massive bank failures, you're removing some genuinely helpful thing in the economy. That is not just not only is it genuinely helpful, it's generally helpful for large sections of the economy. This isn't like, oh, I removed some small bit of technology that improves their ability to make fasteners or something. No. This is pretty fundamental. This is structural. If you imagine a country that doesn't have a financial sector, that has trouble with people borrowing money and being able to build credit and all this stuff, you're like, oh, that country's going to have a hard time developing. Right? We talked about this when we talked in terms of economic development and this idea of institutional infrastructure. Not the physical infrastructure, but the institutions that help govern and lower transactions and make it easy to develop. Well, if you take that out, that is a real shock. That is an LRAS shift. Removed this really well-functioning, valuable thing. This is sort of, you can imagine as the 80 shifting left. That is what caused the recession. This is what made it into a depression. Any questions? Okay. So 80 shifted left caused it to make it a little recession. Bank failures, LRAS shifting left, created the depression conditions. And I think too I talked about did I talk about Ben Bernanke and Silicon Valley Bank last time? Yeah, right. This is why we were so concerned. There's still this question why did it last so long? Because the Great Depression did not last a couple of years. It lasted 10 years or longer, depending on how you define when it actually ended. So, the gold standard ended for most people in 1933. Who was president at the time? FDR. You got the letters. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he ended the gold standard, which was great. Like Ben Bernanke, for example, I can't remember who he did work with. Who was that paper with? James, right? Bernanke and James, 1990, showed that the faster the country left the gold standard, the faster they recovered from the Great Depression. Spain never really got back on the gold standard, and so they largely avoided the big problems of the Great Depression. The problem is, like, a couple of months after FDR got us out of the gold standard, at least for most people, he introduced the New Deal. What do you know about the New Deal?
Social Security.
So we think about Social Security. There's a lot of legislation. I don't know if Social Security is technically bundled in with that, but it might be. Yeah.
Creation of like many government programs
Mm-hmm.
to like increase jobs. So and even like the maybe not the so a lot of government organizations will be and also just things to make people work.
Mm-hmm.
Like more construction, work jobs, easy for things like art.
Yeah. Like the big one we think of is like the PWI, the Public Works Industry. So we're going to categorize the New Deal into good parts and bad parts. When we talk about the Great Depression, we're going to focus on the bad parts. And then when we do fiscal policy, I'll mention the good parts. Because part of the New Deal included things like, so we have the New Deal. The National Recovery Act. And I always want to spell it out. I don't want to give it by its abbreviation, NRA, because that gets confusing with National Rifle Association. Totally different, of course. National Recovery Act set maximum hours for work. It also, we got, in fact, I had something like, found data suggests it was about 22% increase in wages. What does that mean? Because it doesn't seem to affect wages. But keep in mind, if you're saying you're getting paid the same, but you are going to work less, that is functionally a wage increase. Another one that they did is we got the federal minimum wage. We also got stronger labor unions. So if you ever hear things about, oh, like this industry can require everyone in the industry to join the union. So we have like the National Autos Workers or the Longshoremen or the Teamsters Union. That's where we get this from. That was, I think, 35. National Labor Relations Act, 1935. Allow union workers to force all other workers for that industry to join the union. Now, this is not all of the New Deal, this is some of the New Deal. Would you consider this to be good stuff or bad stuff? Good. Why?
To protect some workers.
Yeah, right? It seems like it's really good. But there's a big problem with it. You know what all this stuff has in common? It makes labor more expensive. It's certainly good for some people, but you are making it more expensive to hire people at a time when there is massive amounts of unemployment. This is not a good idea. This is one of those things that seems really nice. People will say, oh, I like the minimum wage. It makes it mean that I pay more. It's like, no, it makes it so some people get paid more, and other people just don't get paid at all. They don't get hired. It's like, oh, it's really great that we have maximum hours and we don't have to work as hard. It's like, yeah, except the problem is now it's like there's less incentive to hire people in the first place because you have to pay them a certain amount of money and then you're not getting very much work out of them. Oh, isn't it great that everyone has to join the labor union? It's like, oh, isn't it great that there's a monopoly on labor? It's great if you are labor, but for many people who want to be hired, it's not so great if you don't get hired, and it reduces the incentive to hire people. So these various wage shocks that occurred all have one thing in common. If you make it more expensive to hire people, what does that sound like? In our list of things that can shift curves. What? SRAS shift. Yeah. Direction? Left. Because all of these are input costs. You forced input costs higher. You said, everyone has to be hired. Everyone has to be hired at high rates. It's like, okay, well then we're not going to get very much hiring. So, in the Midas paradox, Scott Summer argued that FDR was doing a really smart thing, got rid of the gold standard. Economies typically recover after that happens. But a few months later, you just dumped that and the NRA on everybody. And people like the sound of it, but everything's scooted back. And this is just a sampling of there's a whole bunch of labor stuff. There's agricultural adjustment acts that set minimum prices for things. It was kind of a hot mess. And so whole massive price controls. And you might wonder, well, why the hell were they doing that? It's a pretty straightforward thing. Lots of people are unemployed. People want jobs. Making it more expensive to hire people seems like a bad idea. What do you suppose they were thinking? You want to take a guess? Yeah.
They want people to feel secure so they spend more money.
Yeah.
People were not spending money at that time.
People were not spending money at the time because this was the problem, right? But people didn't necessarily see this. They saw this. They saw the deflation. And they were like, I know how to solve the deflation. Let's force prices up, and then so everyone can afford it, let's force wages up too. And that just made things worse. Yeah. What? Well, I mean, there's going to be eventually an equilibrium. So we don't want to necessarily say just cycles, because in economics, we don't want to say this constant fluctuation, because it seems like people would figure that out, right? Eventually we settle into something. So I don't want to necessarily say we loop, but if we imagine first there was this, then we're going to do this, and then we do this. And that's like a lot of stuff, but it shows the down, down, down GDP. Now, is that where it's going to be permanently forever? Well, no, but there was a lot of uncertainty. We can add more stuff in, but this is already really hard to read, so I make a list. Does that answer your question? And you can see a little bit of the logic, right? If you're shifting SRAS to the left, you are going to get some upward pressure on prices. But that's not really how you want it. Okay. Well, let's then briefly, so any questions, by the way? Exactly what caused the end of the Great Depression is a bit controversial because it's hard to actually pinpoint. Some economists focus on World War II because that does have, at least the story of lots of government spending, lots of stability as well. But we didn't even talk about regime uncertainty. You could also argue, though, that really, World War II was not, a great time for people. It seems odd to say that's a recovery period when, people are rationing food and consumption, production is, you're making a lot of tanks, you're not making any cars, and people are, planting gardens to survive. That seems kind of weird to say that the recovery happened. But notably, what did not happen is after World War II was over, the Depression did not return. There was genuine concern about that. It did not come back. So clearly, exactly when the recovery occurred, when the Depression truly ended, it's a matter of debate. I gave you 39. You could argue really 45, somewhere between those two. So, take a look at this diagram. Let's focus on the most important part, the thing that started the whole darn thing. That purple line right there, the AD shift. What should we have done? Not necessarily FDR 33, things were already pretty shitty at 33. But in 29, in 30, what should have happened? What would have been best? Keep in mind, the problem is the purple shift. The problem is AD shifted to the left. The problem is this. What would be the ideal solution? Francis, what would be the ideal solution? Yeah. Or generally speaking, shift what? Shift it back. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You're looking at me it can't be that easy. Oh, it is. It would be really great if we didn't do any of this crap. Things went badly, and then we fixed it. And this is going to be the theme of fiscal policy. Also, monetary policy. Both monetary and fiscal policy are all about shifting aggregate demand, using the either tools of Congress and the president, in other words, doing it through the government budget, or through the central bank. In other words, using the money supply. Those are going to be the things that guide us through basically the rest of the semester. We do fiscal policy today and Thursday, and then monetary policy a week from today, and then we're done. And then we do review on Thursday. Okay. So, in order to do, to give you an example, you just talk about the good parts. I'll give you a preview actually. Good parts of New Deal, Public Works Administration. Let's hire people to go do things, build stuff. How do you pay them? What do you do? Who pays these people who are going in the Public Works Administration? The government. Where does the government get the money from? Well, right? Yeah, it might go in debt, and it just increases government spending. What happens when you increase government spending? What happens in the diagram? It increases GDP because what happens in the diagram, Fatima? What shifts? AD shifts. Remember we had that list. One of the things that shifts aggregate demand is holding everything else constant. You increase government spending, 80 shifts to the right. That's fiscal policy in a nutshell. There's a lot more, but that's the basic. That's like the most basic. Right? Cut taxes, increase spending, 80 shifts right. Done. Any questions? This might be intro course, but we're going to do more than just the basics. And in order to do more than just the basics, we need a little background. We're going to dissect what people do with their income. Now, Melissa, there's a hunk of income that people get every year, every month, whether they get a paycheck, whatever. There is a part, though, that they absolutely have to pay. There's some part, there's some expense that people have to pay that, well, if you don't pay it, you go to jail. What's that part? It's taxes. So we're going to focus only on the income that people have complete control over. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Like, don't we have like, tax credits and so forth, and people can manipulate it? Yeah, I'm going to set that aside. We're focusing on what we call disposable income. I'm going to call that DI. Disposable income is literally income after tax. Let's imagine I have $20 here, Melissa. Let's imagine I buy something from you that costs $20. Maybe you decided to make some lunch or something, a sandwich. And I'm like, ooh, that sandwich looks good. Here's $20, I buy the sandwich. Setting aside taxes, we're just going to focus only on this money that you got. What would you do with this money now that you have an additional $20? There's only two things you can, let me back up. There's only two things people can do with money. Spend it, save it. So my question is, we're going to call savings S, and spending also begins with S. That's confusing. So we're going to call it instead what? Consumption. So Melissa can either save or consume. Now, my question for you, Melissa, is how many dollars would you consume? How many dollars go to your bank account? Please do not do 100% either way, because that's going to make this hard. Give me a number. I don't care what it is, though 50-50 is kind of boring, but I won't judge you if you do that. How do you want to divvy this up? Don't talk, it's Melissa's decision. Oh, but I want to know, okay, but how many dollars would go to saving? How many dollars would go to consumption? That's up to you. We can do that. So, e.g., you said $15 spend? Okay. Again, we want to use consumption. That's going to get confusing. $5 saved. Alrighty. Now, that won't be so bad. We know that if you take disposable income, it's going to equal all the consumption plus all the savings. If you, do we know what the triangle means? Change in. The change in disposable income is thus going to be equal to the change in consumption plus the change in spending. Case in point, Melissa got an additional $20 in disposable income, and she decided to consume an additional 15 and save an additional 5. But we're curious though, because again, if the government's spending money, we're doing this because we're trying to figure out what larger effects this government spending will have. So if the government's spending money, it's not working with no $20. It's working with 20 million, 20 billion. So we want to think in terms of a tendency. There's a word that means tendency, but it's a bit fancier. We want the marginal propensity to consume, also known as MPC. MPC is change in C divided by change in DI. What was Melissa's MPC in this example? Nope. Let's get 3. We took 15 divided by 5, I think. Remember, this is change in DI, so it's going to be which is yeah, 3/4 or 0.7. We also have marginal propensity to save, MPS, and that is going to be equal to change in savings divided by change in DI. And if you take the MPC and you add in the MPS, you always get what? What was that, Fatima? 1. You'd be surprised how long it takes us to get there sometimes. Exactly right. Nice. Why is it 1? Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. 75% of Melissa's income is going to go to consumption. This is going to be 25%. Now it has to equal 100% because you can only either save or consume. So it has to equal 100%. We good so far? All right then, let's talk about why we care. Because what I'm curious about is like, wait a minute. If the government spends money by, let's say, hiring a bunch of people to go build schools all over the country, or nature trails, or whatever the hell they're doing, for the Public Works Administration, I'm paying them, right? And then that money goes into their pocket. Income equals expenditures. If it's going to the pocket, they're not going to rub their naked bodies with it. What do people do with money? They spend it. And I want to know, well, what percent do I think they're going to spend? Because if they spend 75%, that means for every $20 I send out, 15 will go to someone else's business and become someone else's income. And then that will then get passed on again as they spend that money. And that will get passed on again as they spend that money. In other words, this basic point is saying the initial change in spending that the government does causes a cascade reaction throughout the economy. As people then get money that they spend, as people then get money that they spend, as people then get money that they then go on to spend. And we want to know, how much total economic activity are we going to get? There's a couple of famous names in economics. One of them is John Maynard Keynes. Have you ever heard that name before? Keynes. It looks like Keynes or something, but it rhymes with praise. Ever heard that name before? Yeah. What have you heard? Mm-hmm. So John Maynard Keynes is a British economist. He was very famous during World War I and during the Great Depression and World War II. He is credited with the person who really started thinking of economics, of macroeconomics as a separate thing. Like rather than always just talking about individual firms, let's think about the economy as a whole. And so we named this idea of the Keynesian multiplier after him. But we also can call it the fiscal multiplier. And it is going to be equal to the change in real GDP divided by that initial change in spending. In the case of my example with Melissa, $20 was that initial change in spending. How much activity does Melissa generate and subsequent people generate? Here's how that change in real GDP is going to go. Because we have change in real GDP. I bought a sandwich from her. She then goes on, and what do you do with that money? What do you spend $15 on anyway? Oh, okay, so you sandwiches. Entrepreneurial. You spend that money to get more sandwich, to get more ingredients. The people who have that money then go on to do what with it? So we're going to assume that everybody has the same marginal propensity to consume as Melissa. What is 75% of $15? Anyone know? This is a lot easier, by the way, when people have like a really high marginal propensity. I guess it's not so bad too when you do half and half. I just find half and half to be boring. You just cut in half, cut in half, cut in half. But pull out a calculator, take 75%. What do you got? That sounds right. 11.25, you said?
Yeah.
Great. And so they will get some additional currency, and they will get some money, and then they will spend 75% of it. And so do that again. What's 75% of 11.25? 8.45? 44. That's not what it's saying. And then there's going to be some more decimal places after that. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And sometimes I would say include the decimal places, but whatever, that's fine. So what does this equal? Anyone? If you take 20 plus 15 plus 11.25 plus 8.44, on and on and on, does this ever end? No, it does not. Mathematically, it does not. So how the hell we can figure out what the change in real GDP is? That's annoying. I didn't think this through. Well, good news, everybody. Oh, did you have something, Liam?
We have to do an infinite series.
We have to do an infinite series, right? So the mathematicians have figured this out for us. And they're like, look, it's hard to figure out exactly what that number is. What we can do is we can figure out what the multiplier is. Now, the more that you consume, would we expect the multiplier to be larger and smaller? Like smaller, right? When you say smaller, it's like let's imagine it was 90% rather than 75%. Then this would be 20 plus 18, right? Plus 90% of 18. So these are good. So we're working with larger numbers here. If, on the other hand, Melissa only spent like 10%, then it would be 20 plus 2 plus 20 cents plus 2 cents. Very small. So in other words, the more money you consume, the larger portion, the bigger your MPC, the bigger the multiplier. Which means you subtract the smaller your MPS, the bigger the multiplier. The Keynesian multiplier is 1 divided by MPS. What is 1 divided by, what was the MPS again? Listen, what was your MPS? What'd you get? It was what? No, so it was 75. So she had, right, her MPC was 15 divided by 20, or 0.75. Therefore, the MPS, 5 divided by 20, or 0.25. Let's assume that her MPS is everyone's, on average. What's 1 divided by 0.25? 4. So we know the multiplier is 4. We do not know the change in real GDP, but we do know the initial change in spending. What was that? What has started this whole thing? I think I saw, what? 29. Solve for change in YR. 80. If you add all this up, we'll get 80. Now, again, this is not us doing this, so this is the government. And the government's going to say, hey, we'll spend this amount of money. And then after we spend that amount of money, people spend money, spend money, spend money. And so even though we're spending, say, 20 billion, we're actually going to get an additional $80 billion in economic activity. It's going to cause this cascade. Any questions? How are we doing on time? We got like lots of time. All right, so if I want to go a little ahead, maybe I should. Is a multiplier. Yeah, go ahead.
But how does the government estimate what the MPS will be?
So there's two things that's going on. We can estimate it, right? We have, economists can do these estimations. We have these, conversations back and forth about like when we see government spend more money, like what kind of economic activity we have. The issue with this Keynesian framework is that it sort of ignores politics. Like I guarantee you that politicians are not thinking it's like, well, maybe we should spend a little bit more because the marginal propensity to consume is like they're not thinking about that at all. Right? There might be some economists knocking on their door during a recession saying, hey, you don't want to spend too much, you want to spend more. They certainly will do op-eds trying to argue one way or the other, but it is hard to estimate it. So great question. But what we're doing is we're identifying pressures. And we have estimated it. We have estimated the size of the multiplier. The thing is, yeah, I might as well do it now. This is our mathematical multiplier. 1 over MPS. The actual multiplier is smaller than 1 over MPS. It's really hard to adjust. It's really hard to keep everything in mind. Remember when I said, "Oh, I'm going to pay you $20, Melissa," and then we said we'll ignore taxes? Well, taxes kind of still exist. All this money that people are getting along every single, all this additional income that they're getting, that's all going to be taxed. And all that, you just imagine money being siphoned off at every single stage. That is going to reduce your multiplier. It's going to reduce it as income tax. It's going to reduce it as sales tax. GDP is also defined within a particular country. But if you buy something from another country, it's going to be multiplied, but it's going to be multiplied somewhere else. Imports are going to reduce that mathematical multiplier. There's going to be all this additional spending. Money begets money begets money. Remember, there's a velocity here to consider. Inflation is going to reduce that multiplier. There's upward pressure on prices, and that's going to reduce real GDP gain. Remember, GDP is not just confined to a country, it's also confined to a year. And it takes time for all of this to go forward. The year ends. Maybe it ends right here. It will eventually work its way through. It will eventually grow the economy. But it takes time to work through that system. And those time limits, the fact that GDP is by definition confined to a year, that's going to reduce the multiplier. And finally, there's our friend opportunity cost. Melissa, you saved $5. What happened to that $5? Did you put it in the bank and the bank just set on fire? What happened to it? No. What? Where'd it go? Anyone? It gains interest, but what does the bank do with it? They lend it out, right? In other words, savings become investment. Investment is also part of GDP. Now, this process takes longer than spending, but it does, but we don't want to pretend it doesn't happen. Granted, if there's a recession, there's not going to be much investment anyway, so maybe the opportunity cost is kind of low during a recession. But during economic expansion, it's not like you can say, oh, and then the government's just going to spend a bunch of money and everything will be fine. It's like, well, no, you're definitely going to get more of an inflation story. You're definitely going to have this opportunity cost. You're going to drink the milkshake of the private sector, and that is going to be a problem. That's going to reduce the multiplier. So when economists estimate the multiplier, remember I looked this up years ago, so the data might be old. But I remember seeing estimates that the multiplier might be 2.5. It also might be 0. It's going to depend on the circumstances. During recessions, the multiplier is pretty darn big. Might be 2, might even be 3. In part because there's not a lot of savings going on, there's not a lot of investment going on. Also because when people have low incomes and you get more money, are you going to be spending a lot of that or saving a lot of it? Spending. Why are you spending? Yeah. You might be, if you can save, if you have that excess capacity. You might be like really worried. I can see that. And you might want to save if you're low income. But all things being equal, if you're very low income and then you get some additional money, you're like, great, we can buy food, we can cover rent, we can make sure that the power doesn't get shut off. Remember how we talked about the sales tax is regressive? I know that was a while ago. Remember, why is the sales tax regressive with you? Do you remember? You put your hand up. You remember?
Yeah, so the sales tax was regressive because I guess people with middle income taxes basically like they're the ones who are
Why are they so?
because it's the same percentage that
Do they spend more?
it's the same percentage that everybody they have like the same like the 6%.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have less and more of their money is going
And because it's going more to spending, right?
I mean, yeah.
Yes. Exactly, right? As we talked about, low income groups tend to spend most of their income. Why? Because it's low income. And you need every dime or dollar you can get to make ends meet. You have lots of things you want to buy because you haven't exhausted that yet. So if there's a recession, we would expect the marginal propensity to consume to go up. If suddenly people have trouble making ends meet, they're going to be eager to spend any money that they get. Well, if marginal propensity to consume goes up, marginal propensity to save goes down. If marginal propensity to save goes down, the multiplier has to go up. So this is why, like, people ask, like, well, what is it? It's like, well, it's changing. It's hard to tell given the different things we can do, and there's a lot of X factors. So this is why it's like a lot of work trying to estimate what it is. And then people are like, well, do politicians care? I'm like, probably not. It seems like unlikely. Maybe on the margin, you can influence them to public opinion this way or that way. People will write op-eds arguing for more spending or less spending based on that multiplier. So maybe the margin, it can matter. But if you want to have good fiscal policy, this is a framework for that. Any questions? Anthony's smiling. It's like, I just went through this whole thing, and then I was like, but who really cares? I did the signaling stuff. Okay. Wow, we have lots of time left. You guys are really quiet. Good sign or a bad sign? I don't know. Yeah, you yammer on one. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you best case scenario for fiscal policy. This is kind of the model that economists who really love fiscal policy have in the back of their mind over and over again. So it's nice to have a sort of like ideal situation, and then maybe we'll do what's it called? Automatic stabilizers, and then we'll talk about, certainly next class we'll talk about this, all the ways it goes wrong. That's pretty fun. Yeah. Funny, that's where I'm going to next. You should probably define it. Fiscal policy is when you shift AD using the government budget. You can either do it for taxes, spending, yep. What do you suppose I mean by deficit spending? I appreciate that. Beatrice, what do you suppose I mean by deficit spending? What does deficit mean? Less than what? Okay. So certainly. So, but the thing is, if we're spending less, does that seem like a deficit? Where do we hear deficit before? Richard, you had your hand up.
It's like when the government's spending too much money on the budget.
Right. But you can also get deficit spending not by spending more money, but also by not making as much, right? So we're going to define deficit spending. Recall we talked about deficits before. The government spends more money than it takes in taxes. That difference is deficit. We're going to define it for our purposes as government spending goes up, taxes go down, or both. Which direction will that shift aggregate demand? Right. And what would you suppose the opposite of deficit spending is? Surplus spending. And that is going to be just the opposite. Government spending goes down, taxes go up, or both. And AD shifts to the left. We shift aggregate demand using the government budget. Keep in mind, this means that if you're doing fiscal policy, you can't increase government spending and pay for it by increasing taxes. One is going to shift 80 to the right, but the other one's going to shift 80 to the left. Nothing's actually going to change. You're just moving money from the private sector into the public sector, and nothing's really happening. Production, I should say. You're moving production from one side to the other. That's not how you shift 80. That's why I categorize this as surplus and deficit spending. Okay, so let's build out our best case scenario. Here is YR. Here is PL. Here's our friend aggregate demand. Here's our friend LRAS. Here's our friend SRAS. This is fiscal policy best case. Step one. Imagine there's a bad thing that happened in the economy. It could be that consumer confidence has plummeted. It could be that interest rates got really high. Whatever it is, the bad thing shifted AD. I'm going to draw that by just drawing AD. There we go. We are now in a recession. I'm going to call this 1. We call this, by the way, a recessionary gap. The difference between what the economy is and what it could be. And then everyone is upset, everyone is concerned, people are losing work, people are losing their jobs, people are struggling to make ends meet. Now, in the long run, this will kind of fix itself, right? Exactly how it fixes itself, depending on what the bad thing is, but in the long run, it'll fix itself. But the long run, as Keynes once said, in the long run, anyone know? In the long run, we're all dead. It would be nice if we could fix the problem now rather than wait. So the government comes in and says, I know what we'll do. We'll spend a bunch of money and cut taxes. We'll prime the pump, so to speak, and we will shift our demand. Now, what's going to happen is two things. And so I'm going to do it this way and this way. I'm going to call these 2A. I'm going to call them 2B. Yeah, that's what 2A is our fiscal policy. The government spends a bunch of money. The government says, let's hire a bunch of people to clean up roads. Let's hire a bunch of people to fix some schools. Let's build some infrastructure projects. We saw this during the Great Recession. Obama signed in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And the government just spent shit tons of money on all kinds of crazy crap. I remember driving on interstates, and you would see construction, and there would be big signs that says, this construction project sponsored by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Which was kind of weird because everyone was annoyed that there was construction. So I don't know if that's how you want to advertise it, but hey, people are being put to work. But the idea is, once people have this money in their pockets, they go out and they spend it. And 2B is the fiscal multiplier. So the government doesn't have to do the whole job. We have this huge gap. The government doesn't have to close the gap all by itself. It just has to start the process, and then other people spend the money, and then other people spend the money, and then those people spend the money, and then over the course of maybe as long as a few years, the gap closes. With the bulk of the activity happening at the beginning. And we're done. During economic recessions, self-described Keynesian economists that are really big fans of fiscal policy, will argue that the multiplier is really large. Why do you suppose they argue that the multiplier is really large? Question is, during economic recessions, Keynesian economists, or economists who are really big fans of fiscal policy, will argue that the Keynesian multiplier is really large. Why do you suppose they want to argue the Keynesian multiplier is really large? Why do you suppose they're pointing that out? Let me do an American example. Let's suppose the multiplier is 4, because that's what we had before. Let's also suppose that the recessionary gap equals, we'll say like, I don't know, $100 billion. That's not very big. Let's say $500 billion. There we go. That the economy is about $500 billion smaller than it should be. Now, if the multiplier is 4, that means that the government will spend a certain amount of money, and then we'll have the actual change in GDP will be 4 times larger. So multiplier equals change in real GDP divided by the initial change in spending. If the multiplier is 4, and the gap we want to close is 500 billion, how much money does the government have to spend? The initial change in spending. So this is G. I'll even call it this.
125.
Exactly. The government only has to spend 125 billion. Now, let's suppose instead the multiplier is huge. Multiplier is 10. How much money does the government have to spend? 50 billion. In other words, Keynesians will argue the multiplier is huge. They will be quick to point out when they can argue the multiplier is huge. They'll be quick to point out the multiplier is huge because the bigger the multiplier, the better the deal it is for government policy. Like we can have a huge effect by spending a pretty small amount of money. If the multiplier is like 1, then we have to close all the gap ourselves. The government has to spend $500 billion. If the government is 10, the government has to spend a tenth of that and still get the same effect. Thus, the other thing we want to keep in mind in this, the bigger the multiplier, the bigger the shift in aggregate demand. Right. The bigger 2B will be. The more effective fiscal policy is. Any questions? Okay, that was a lot. So we're gonna stop right now, and we will continue this conversation on Thursday.